Chocolate City, and I'm going to have to read the book again after the study. And I said this in worship last week. If you are not part of one of the study groups, I highly recommend that you buy this book and read it on your own time. I've just been floored by what I found. And I'm from there. I mean, I've lived in Maryland all my life. So is my whole family and my husband. But all I've learned about Maryland, D.C., and Virginia that you never knew. It's amazing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for writing this book. And again, please get it if you have not. And I'm going to put my foot in my mouth. If you have trouble financially getting the book, please see me. I will make sure that you get a copy of the book. All right? And now, Dr. Musgrove.
Thank you. Well, thank you to Marie Matthews. Thanks to all of you all for being here. Marie has asked me to address two topics. And so I can, well, we're not ready yet. But once we are, I can lay those out for you on the slide, but I'll talk about them really quickly. The first is just to give a sort of a standard book talk, to talk about the major themes in the book. And those will, I think, really speak to what is in the news today and the way that the White House and members of Congress are signaling their intentions towards the District of Columbia and what they're capable of doing. The other is to talk about the history of racial segregation in Washington, D.C., which is very much a 20th century story. And so I'll talk about the Chocolate City years, those years where the district was understood as sort of the preeminent black majority city in the United States of America, how that occurred, and then how it declined over time to the point where the city is no longer a black majority, has about a 45% black population today. How are we doing? Okay. And do you need a different connector? Because I have it.
Just this is so outdated, it doesn't have HDMI.
Oh, that'll do it. All right. So let's go ahead and get started, and we'll catch up to the slides as they come on. So as a sort of introduction, I want to point out that the district is at an inflection point. And the district, not just itself is at an inflection point, but American democracy is at an inflection point, which gives an urgency, I think, to our discussion today. Just this past week, President Donald Trump argued that the federal government, and I'm quoting him here, should take over Washington, D.C. I think that we should run it strong, run it with law and order, make it absolutely, flawlessly beautiful. And this is what he stated above Air Force One, I believe, on Wednesday. And this was not a one-off. The president's comments echoes those he had made on the campaign trail in the language of the RNC platform, which apparently if you listen to it, sounds like he dictated. They are also reflected in bills before the House and the Senate on Capitol Hill right now. Blessedly, neither one has more than a very small handful of co-sponsors. I think it's 9 in the House, 3 in the Senate. But you never know these days. And these are all aimed at abolishing home rule. Just to give you an idea of how unserious the individuals who introduce these bills are, the bill essentially says we're going to get rid of the home rule government, and they don't say what they're going to replace it with. And so they would effectively destroy local government for 700,000 U.S. citizens and not replace it with an actual form of government in this legislation. They said, we'll just sort of leave that for later. And this gets me to the argument I hope to impress upon all of you today. And can I ask that the volume be turned down just a little bit? I tend to scream and get all excited, and so I don't want to scare myself or others. And that is that the District of Columbia is not simply the place where the federal government convenes. It has served over the course of our nation's history as a barometer of our dedication to democracy, particularly our willingness to embrace multiracial democracy. And today, as a man who talks openly of imperialism and several of whose closest aides have flashed Nazi salutes in front of thousands of people with cameras rolling, among many other anti-democratic grotesqueries. As this man resides in the White House, democracy in the district is under threat. To make my case, let me summarize for you the 1 in 3 themes at the core of the book. And this is an odd formulation, but I've been using it for a while. There's one big theme that's at the core of Chocolate City that sort of stands on its own. And then there are 3 themes that are intricately connected that intersect with that other theme. And so I talk about my 1 in 3 themes. And I was really hoping to show you these pictures, but we'll work it out. So any good story about the district should start in the beginning. And we start Chocolate City, as many of you know, in 1608 with the struggle over governance of the region set off by the establishment of Jamestown just the year before. For many of you, you know that the Jamestown colonists sort of go and map out the king's new domain, and so they head up all the different river systems that are connected to the bay. And about a year after they establish Jamestown, they head up the Potomac and encounter Nacotchtank, which is the Native American village that was situated right where Joint Base Anacostia Bowling currently sits. And that moment is really sort of the beginning of the end for the Nacostan, the Native Americans who lived in that village. And over the course of roughly the next 100 years, the colonists who had sort of put their anchor down at Jamestown, and later the ones that established the city of St. Mary's here in Maryland, displaced the Native American population and transformed the region into tobacco plantation country. Just to give you an idea of how this plays out in the district, Georgetown and Alexandria are founded as tobacco warehousing ports. That was their purpose. In the late 18th century, where the wharf stands today in downtown DC, the area around it, and this is just to give you an example, was the heart of the Notley Young plantation. My colleagues at UMBC have actually put together a wonderful sort of digital image of what the plantation looks like and sort of grafted it on top of 395 and Haynes Point and everything else. And Notley Young owned about an 800-acre farm and 265 human beings. And their labor gave him and his descendants the wealth and time to become prominent figures in Maryland politics. Of course, the district was part of Maryland at the time. And just to give you an idea of how lasting this power was, Young's son-in-law, Robert Brent, served as the first mayor of Washington, D.C. So long after Notley Young passed from the scene, the privilege and the power that his father-in-law had amassed sort of allows for, is perpetuated through time. Now, the nation's capital is built atop this plantation society and adopts much of its political, economic, and demographic scaffolding. And this is where the themes begin to come into play. As the city is built in the 1790s on top of this plantation society, we get our first theme, our 1 theme, and that is the district is always, as far as my co-author and I are concerned, a chocolate city. By that we mean that it has a very large black population from its inception, and it never really loses it. When the city is founded, the black population is roughly 20–25%, and black labor is absolutely crucial for the functioning of the larger economy and for the building of the capital city. At no time in the city's subsequent 235-year history does the black population dip below roughly 18%. In fact, it only dips below 20% for a couple of years in the 1850s due to pretty significant white in-migration. Beyond that, the district is actually a place where there's not only a large black minority, but there is a black majority. In the 1950s, the district becomes the first major American city with a black majority in the United States of America, which when I say it now, I think folks sort of, it sort of boggles my mind, because when we think of cities, we think of black populations in the United States today. But prior to the 1950s, you could not find one over 100,000 people that had a black majority. The district is the first. And it would remain a very large black population through the 1990s, over 60%. Now, aside from being a place where there were a lot of black people, because I think we all know from the Black Lives Matter protests and the discussion of Ferguson, Missouri, that a place with a lot of black people isn't necessarily a nice place for black people. Aside from being a place where there were a lot of black people, it was also a place of tremendous black affluence. Even in the 1830s, in the middle of the interstate slave trade, which was literally ripping 750,000 people from the larger Chesapeake region, sending them down the coast or across land into the Cotton Kingdom, DC was a relatively free place for African Americans. And it was dotted, I should point out, with some of the largest slave transshipment firms in the country at the time. But on the streets around those firms, about half of the black population is free. And they are building schools, they are building churches, they are finding ways to own land and to transfer it to their children. So they were quite affluent by comparison with other black folks in the country. Aside from that, during the Civil War, the federal government gave a significant amount of resources to African Americans in the form of land in places like Hillsdale, which we think of as Berry Farm, Howard University, which is funded by the Freedmen's Bureau, and of course the DC public school system, which, because it was mandated that all the teachers in DC be paid the same independent of race, was mandated by Congress. It creates one of the most affluent African American teaching forces in the entire country, unlike in the South, where black teachers were systematically underpaid, even though they had more people when it comes to the black population. And just to give you an idea of how affluent and how successful this black population is, if you looked at those black teachers that were in DCPS in the early 20th century, you would find that they were enormously successful, enormously successful. There are 4 textbooks written in the first 20 years of the 20th century that focus on African American history. One of them was written by a public school teacher in North Carolina. The other 3 were written by DCPS teachers. One of them being Carter G. Woodson, not just like someone you don't know about. And so DC is a place where there's a lot of black people and a lot of very affluent black people. And so we argue that even when it's not a black majority in the book, it can be referred to as a chocolate city, although we do point out that the chocolate city years are quite distinct, and I'll talk about that in the second half of the lecture. Now let's get to our 3 themes. At the core of the district's history, and in fact at the core of the problems that the city is facing today, is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the U.S. Constitution, which states that Congress has the power of exclusive legislation over the nation's capital, the federal district. And what that means is that Congress can govern the city directly. Congress can delegate that power to an unelected individual like the president. Congress can delegate that power to a local government that then stands for election and has some democratic exchange with the citizenry. And Congress has, by and large, done all of those things, and typically in a manner that bespeaks the larger national interest in democracy, the larger national dedication to democracy that you see across the country. So just to give you 4 quick examples. During the period of Jacksonian reform in the early 19th century, where there was a demand to make sure that white working class Americans, not just white elites, had a say in their government. The district government goes from one that is primarily appointed and only secondarily elected, which Congress had sort of set up in the early years of the 19th century, to one in which all white men, independent of whether or not they owned property, would have access to the franchise. And so it's got a relatively robust, all-white, all-male electorate by the time we get into the 1840s and 1850s, and not without struggle. During Reconstruction, this is changed. Congress is one of the first institutions around the country to vote for Negro suffrage, Negro male suffrage in the District of Columbia. And so in 1867, 1868, African Americans in Georgetown and then in what we used to call Washington City are voting for mayor and voting for members of their legislature, something that would happen across the South in the years after that. But just as there's a racist backlash against Reconstruction across the South, you see it sort of fastening itself probably in the most extreme form in the District of Columbia that you can find around the country, as white Democrats are pushing to get rid of biracial democracy across the South. Democrats and conservative Republicans in Congress are pushing to get rid of democracy in the District of Columbia. A lot of reactionaries or anti-democratic forces in the district say, look, we don't want black suffrage, and we've had it for about 8 years now. But we also don't want white working class suffrage, because those folks sometimes vote against our interests as elite people too. And so what they do in 1874 is get rid of all voting in the District of Columbia. They actually convinced Congress through a massive lobbying campaign just to get rid of the government altogether, and they gave the president the power to appoint 3 commissioners who will run the city, and then Congress will oversee what they do. And this remains the case for 100 years, from 1874 until 1974. And then what you see is another national movement changing the way that the district is governed, and that's in the 1960s and 1970s, as the civil rights movement is demanding a reckoning with our failures to live up to our democratic creed across the country. They are some of those same civil rights activists, in particular Walter Fauntroy, a close friend and confidant of Martin Luther King, are pushing Congress to return democracy to the District of Columbia, and they do so in steps. A school board in 1968, non-voting representative Congress in 1971, and then the home rule government in 1974. And so this relationship that Congress has with the district ends up leading to my three additional themes here. The first is that the district is not just this place where government meets, but it in fact is a battleground where different factions of Americans fight over their vision of the country and fight to enact their vision of the country in the federal district where Congress has a complete control. To give you an idea of how this plays out, I'll talk about the 1830s, where the fight over slavery between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces quite literally transfixed folks who were focused on the District of Columbia. William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist who for a time called the district home, argued that DC was the first citadel to be taken in the larger struggle to end slavery across the South. And so if we can end it in DC, in this nationally symbolic place, then we can begin to push back against slavery across the South. At the same time, John C. Calhoun, a powerful South Carolina senator, and a person who not only believed that slavery was good for him, but argued quite vociferously that slavery was a positive good for the slaves, because we are teaching them how to be civilized. John C. Calhoun, pushing back against Garrison and those like him, said that DC would be the South's Thermopylae, its weak point that must be defended at any cost. If they are able to get rid of the slave trade or slavery here, they will be able to come after us in South Carolina or Mississippi or elsewhere. And in this era, slavery literally determined the shape of the district. The retrocession of Alexandria, which happened in 1846, was facilitated by the fact that slave traders in Alexandria were fearful that someone in Congress would introduce a bill to ban the slave trade in the District of Columbia. And the economic interests behind the slave trade in the District of Columbia were quite significant. For those of you who've ever driven down Duke Street in Alexandria, you may have driven by the Freedom House Museum. And that was an old slave trading firm which the Urban League purchased and then turned into a museum of the interstate slave trade. The business that was run out of that one property, which is just a row house on Duke Street, was that they would sell approximately 1,000 human beings per year, every single year, for every year of the 1830s, right? And each one of those people was equal, in rough terms, if you adjust for inflation, to the price of a BMW sedan, right? So you're talking about a huge amount of money. Those people realized that their business was under threat, and so they reached out to the large slave owners downstate in the Tidewater in Virginia and said, if we vote to come back to Virginia, can y'all orchestrate a vote in Congress that will also get Congress to give us back? And they said, absolutely. And so the shape of the district, the reason we don't have the Virginia side is in part because of these battles over slavery in the early years of the 19th century. Second thing is that the district is a laboratory. You can see this today. Folks are talking in Congress about all these policies that they're not arguing they should have in their home states necessarily, but they want to try them out in the district, perhaps as a way to convince people in their home states that this is a good idea. And I'll just give you some examples from a more positive side of the ledger than the one that I just gave you when it came to the district being a battleground. In the 1860s and 1870s, the district was absolutely a laboratory, and thank God it was. In 1862, as Abraham Lincoln is trying to figure out whether or not he wants to introduce the Emancipation Proclamation, he decides, along with radicals in Congress, to try emancipation out in the District of Columbia, see how it goes, and then he'll move forward with the Emancipation Proclamation. So in April of 1862, the district became the only place in the country to try compensated emancipation. Lincoln always thought that compensation may have softened the blow, and so the idea is that slavery is over, you have to give up your slaves, but we'll pay you for them. We'll actually pay you roughly $300 a piece out of the federal treasury, which was a real bargain considering the prices that folks could have gotten. They would usually be around $900 to $1,500 in those days dollars. But that was all the federal government was offering. If you didn't take it, stinks to be you. Lincoln tries it out. It ends up freeing about 3,100 people. And a couple months later, he pushes forward the Emancipation Proclamation. In 1867, Congress decides to try out another very radical program in the District of Columbia. As radicals in Congress are considering the 14th Amendment, they pass the Negro Suffrage Act in Congress in 1867, which essentially enfranchises the black male residents of the District of Columbia. Those black male residents then immediately go out and vote the incumbent mayor of Georgetown out of office. He was a wretched Negro hater, as people would have called him at the time, and they punished him at the polls for that. But Congress, on the back end of that vote, moves forward with the 14th Amendment, which of course is ratified a couple of years later. And then in 1874, I mentioned this a moment ago, but I'll lay it out one more time. As reactionaries are looking at ways to push back against Reconstruction, they use the district again as their focus. And so this is the place where they not only get rid of black voting, but all voting in order to get rid of Reconstruction. And then the last theme that I just want to lay out before I get into a good story here is that the district ends up being a stage. It is the stage on which the pageantry of American democracy takes place. And so it's a symbolically important place for national political figures who want to make a statement. You can see this in all of the marches on Washington. You can see this a couple of years ago in both the Black Lives Matter protests in Lafayette Park, the president's efforts to squash those protests in Lafayette Park, and on and on and on. And as we will see in the story I'm about to tell, all of these themes play out in the district during the 20th century. So let me get into this conversation about race and demographic change and housing segregation in the District of Columbia. Just to set the scene, and the maps were really cool, but again, right? I'll send them to you. In the 1880s, the district population is really quite small, and the city is essentially packed below Florida Avenue. And so if you think of Florida Avenue as sort of the northern boundary of the district, much of what's above that is you know, there's sort of the road where all of the farmers who were heading down to Central Market on 7th Street would come up this way towards the farms that are in the area. There's Howard University, but pretty much the rest inside the district's limits is farmland. Big pig farms on the Maryland side, on the other side of the river. Grain farms going up this way to a certain degree. And so you only have about 177,000 people in the district in the 1880s. Things change a little bit in the next 50 years. By 1930, the district's population is 486,000. And by 1950, it probably tops 900,000. There's a question there. But there's no question that during World War II, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the district's population was the largest it's ever been, and it was somewhere between 850 and 950,000 people. And for pretty much this entire period that I just mentioned, African Americans are roughly 30% of the district's population. And through all of this growth, the district remains stubbornly segregated. In fact, it segregates during this period. Much of the city below Florida Avenue was not built at a time when the district had very strong segregation laws, when it had a fully formed real estate lobby that focused on making sure that there were race and class specific neighborhoods. But after the 1880s, particularly in the 1890s to the 1950s, the district had all of those things. And all of the neighborhoods that were built in a very decidedly segregated manner, and residents themselves took it upon themselves to try and retroactively segregate their neighborhoods in the city inside Florida Avenue, to see if they could sort of create what their fellows out in the newer parts of the city were doing. They did this through a couple things: restrictive covenants, discriminatory lending, and steering by real estate agents, only taking people to specific neighborhoods. And what this ends up doing is concentrating African Americans in an inner city black belt. It's literally what folks called it at the time, which was quite literally a ring of older houses around the center of the city, stretching from Foggy Bottom in the west up through what we now call Shaw, around to Anacostia, and in the east. And much of what was outside of that had been secured as segregated, either through deeds or restrictive covenants. After the New Deal is enacted by redlining through the federal government, which essentially just adopts and codifies all of the policies that these folks had used on the local level to segregate the government in the first place. Now, after World War II, things changed pretty dramatically in the district. We think of the 1950s as sort of the heart of the civil rights movement. Emmett Till is killed in 1955. The Montgomery bus boycott is in 1955. Brown versus Board of Education is, of course, 1954. And what a lot of people say and argue is that that sort of begins the Southern Civil Rights Movement, and then you get these escalating protests through the late 1950s, early 1960s that eventually bring us the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, 1964 and 1965. All of that drama had effectively been taken care of by 1954 inside the District of Columbia. And the main reason was that segregation in the District of Columbia was deeply embarrassing to the State Department and to the President in the middle of the Cold War, as we are setting ourselves up as the sort of the center of the free world, the defenders of the free world. And so in 1948, the Supreme Court, with amicus curiae briefs from the Justice Department, ends restrictive covenants in the District of Columbia. You cannot use a restrictive covenant, and I should stop here because I'm leaning on slides that are not here. Does everyone know what a restrictive covenant is? Okay, so I got not really. So a restrict. Sure.
Is it necessarily a written document, or sometimes is it just verbal?
It is to really be a restrictive covenant, it has to be a legal document, and so therefore it has to be written. But people oftentimes buttress that with verbal agreements among neighbors, and so I'll explain. So when I first purchased my house in Shepherd Park, which is just a couple miles south of here, right in the tip of Washington, D.C., and all those houses were built in the 1920s. The second page of my deed had a restrictive covenant, and it said quite specifically, this house cannot be sold, rented, or otherwise transferred to Persians, Jews, or Negroes. And if you do, the builder in this case, because the builder had inserted the restrictive covenant, could in fact sue you, right, for damages. Now, that's what happens when a discriminatory builder builds using and then sells houses using restrictive covenants. And you can find old pictures. I actually had one of neighborhoods in northern DC and then also in southern Montgomery County, where it would say like Northgate, coming by here, or Shepherd Park coming by here, restricted community. So they were advertised as segregated communities. The people that were buying into them understood that that was the deal, that this was what they were going to get, right? And then, of course, people further south in like Eckington and some of the neighborhoods that were below Florida Avenue initiated restrictive covenants by essentially calling a block association meeting or a neighborhood association meeting and entering into a legal agreement, all of the white neighbors, essentially saying, if you sell, rent, or otherwise transfer this property to a person of these banned races, we, as your neighbors, can sue you for damages. And so if I had signed one of those restrictive covenants, I could literally sell my house to an African American and my neighbors could sue me for damages based on that agreement. And the Supreme Court said that that was fine for the first roughly 40 years of the 20th century. But in 1948, because of the problem of the Cold War, remember, we're begging newly independent African countries, South Asian countries, come on and join the US's side against the Russians. We're the side of freedom. They're the side of tyranny. And then their representatives would come to the United Nations at New York, and then they'd drive down here to DC to meet with the State Department, and they couldn't eat in downtown restaurants. And they couldn't stop to relieve themselves in the gas stations along Route 40 in Maryland, right? It was a tremendously embarrassing to the State Department, right? And so they put pressure on the courts through the amicus briefs to get rid of this. That starts in 1948 with the end of restrictive covenants in the district. At least on paper, you can live anywhere you want. No one can sue you for damages. The problem, of course, is that real estate agents are still steering people and things of that nature. But over the next couple of years, this keeps happening. The federal government moves to get rid of segregation at the National Zoo, at National Airport. Local Catholic schools desegregate. And then, of course, you see the coup de grace with two cases in the early 1950s. One is against Thompson's Restaurant downtown, brought by the venerable civil rights activist Mary Church Terrell. And that basically states that there is a law on the books passed by the Reconstruction City Council back in the 1870s that says you may not, if you're a private organization in the District of Columbia, discriminate. And if you do, people can sue for damages. And when the Reconstruction governments were wiped away, and here's where the sort of laziness of the contemporary Congress sort of coming back to as a historical echo. When the Reconstruction governments were wiped away, they never got rid of the law. Congress never got rid of the law. So this anti-discrimination law is on the books. And people just stopped following it. So Mary Church Terrell was alerted to the fact that by some law students at Howard University, led by Pauli Murray, famous legal scholar, that this thing is still on the books. It's illegal to segregate in DC. All these practices that all these restaurants are engaged in for the last couple of decades, it's illegal based on the laws of the district. They take the court case to the Supreme Court. The Justice Department files an amicus brief because of that Cold War imperative. And the Supreme Court says, yes, District of Columbia, you must follow your own laws, right? Not exactly a legal precedent, but it changed because it ends public sector segregation in public accommodations in the District of Columbia. And then the next year is Brown versus Board of Education, which ends segregation in DC schools. So by 1954, effectively the city is on paper desegregated. White DC residents who are still in a significant majority now have a choice. We're going to stick around because we don't have a local government to fight this with. So are we going to stick around and integrate, or are we going to leave? And they leave. 300,000 white DC residents leave between 1950 and 1970, a majority of the white population. And the only ones that stay, by and large, are poor whites in Anacostia. Anacostia was 80% white in the 1950s. Poor whites in Anacostia who really don't have a lot of money to leave, and rich whites in the Ward 3 area who can wall themselves off from the rest of the city. Now, the federal government, seeing what is happening, kind of freaks out and says, we have to have a plan to bring white middle class people who are flooding into the suburbs, up here to Montgomery County, over to Prince George's County. We have to find a way to keep them. They initiate an urban renewal process, right? And they start demolishing whole neighborhoods downtown near the Capitol with the hopes that those people who had moved to Silver Spring and some other places would in fact come back downtown, get a nice, cool, modern house in Southwest, and then they'd be able to walk to their white-collar job at the Capitol or at one of the major agencies. And so they literally go into Southwest, an entire quadrant of the District of Columbia, and level every single house, seize them through eminent domain, and destroy them, except for the churches. And if you walk through Southwest today, you'll think, wow, this entire neighborhood was built in this modernist style in the 1960s. Yes, it was, because the entire old neighborhood was demolished in the 1950s to make way for new houses for white middle-class federal bureaucrats. By and large, and by the way, there's 23,000 people whose houses were demolished. They were 75% black. They were majority working class. There were still a good number of white working class folks in the city at the time. And they pretty much all get pushed out. When the neighborhood is repopulated in the 1960s and 1970s, it is majority white and significantly richer. And so the process does work in a way, but it doesn't bring back enough white residents from the suburbs to really make a significant difference in the city's demographics. What it does do is it takes that 23,000 group of poor people who were in Southwest, who had to scatter when their houses were destroyed. Many of them head across the river because it's the one place that the district is building public housing. And these are poor folks. And when they enter those neighborhoods in Anacostia and Congress Heights and some Deanwood, all the white working class people from those neighborhoods leave. And so urban renewal actually ends up making the district even blacker and accelerating white flight because it destabilizes the neighborhoods that it touches. And so by the late 1970s, Washington Post wrote several articles where the reporters went out searching for the last white people in Anacostia, right? And these are actual titles, right? And they found them a couple of times. I think the last one we can argue might be the one that actually works. What you ended up having is that after this whole process is there's not a center city black belt anymore. It sort of rejiggers the city's demographics. What you have is that the entire east side of the city, east of Rock Creek Park, is basically black folks. Poorer folks to the south, middle class and upper class black folks to the north. And then the only place you can really find white folks by the late 1960s and 1970s, approximately 30% of the population. The only place you can find them is west of the park. And that's primarily because urban renewal wipes out that white population in Anacostia. And these are really the Chocolate City years. 1957, DC gains its black majority. By 1975, when Parliament Funkadelic, easily the best band in the history of mankind, puts out its album Chocolate City, which was an ode to Washington, DC, the black population is roughly 73%. right? And there's a local magazine that put out this wonderful cover. I always wish we had purchased it so we could have put it in the book, where it had a young person holding an ice cream cone with one vanilla scoop and then 3 chocolate scoops on top to signify the demographics of Washington, D.C. And what I don't think we recognize, particularly being in such a multicultural county, or if you are coming from D.C., being in a multicultural city, is that the idea of being a white minority in a majority black city was, for many district residents at the time, terrifying. Terrifying. And so folks are literally advocating for their own powerlessness because they hope it will protect them. I really, there's discussions in Congress about returning democracy to the district. And large numbers of white folks who were interviewed for this magazine say, I really hope they don't give the district democracy, because that would mean black people will be in control. And what would they do to us? Right? So it's a time of tremendous flux. But for many African Americans, this was a really exciting time because the city is chock full of activists. And those folks begin a really concerted push to demand the return of democracy to the District of Columbia. And they are largely successful, collaborating with liberals in Congress in both political parties. This is back when the GOP had liberals, and Democrats had arch conservatives. We've still got a few. What you see is that in 1968, we get a school board, 1971, non-voting delegate to Congress, and then in 1973, there's a successful push to move through the Home Rule Act. We, of course, have our first elections in 1974, and so we have the return of democracy to the nation's capital. And that government that gets elected in the District of Columbia is not just going to be a majority black government, but it's going to be one that is structured by the ethos and the concerns and the ideology of the civil rights and black power movements. If you look at the first Home Rule Council that's seated in 1975, a supermajority of its members, including its white members, are civil rights, anti-poverty, or black power activists. Right? Sterling Tucker, the chair of the council at the time, said, these folks came in here damning the man and talking about, overthrowing the system. And I was like, guys, we are the system. We are the man. You need to get to work. But the beauty of that was that you had the civil rights and the black power movement with an opportunity to run a city and to actually sort of show the country that the precepts of these movements were good for structuring American life. And so there's this real possibility here. On top of that, and just talk quickly about the exciting aspects of Chocolate City, is that the city is absolutely awash in black culture. People like Roberta Flack are DCPS teachers who are teaching their students during the day and then heading over to Mr. Henry's on Pennsylvania Avenue, recording some of the iconic music of the 1970s at night. Chuck Brown, a former prisoner from the DC jail down in Virginia, is literally creating an entirely new music with some of his Latin collaborators in places like Shaw and Columbia Heights, and that's, of course, go-go. And then, of course, all of the major black poets and artists of the 1960s and 1970s are coming to DC for this massive black audience that they have there, roughly over 500,000 people, and because of all the institutions that can host them. Places like the Black Repertory Theater on Georgia Avenue, School for African American, the New Thing Art and Architecture Center in Columbia Heights, etc. And so you had this really fecund moment where the city has a black majority, the return of democracy, and is absolutely awash in black art. And all of this works out positively, wonderfully, until the city realizes the problems with the home rule legislation. And Marie, I'm going to stop in about 5 minutes. I was going to ask, but I'm just going to go ahead and cut myself off in about 5 minutes. And that is that the very things that allow the city to become Chocolate City, drain it of money, and eventually make it so that it simply cannot run and Congress takes it back over. And I'll give you a couple examples. The first is that the white flight that allows for this black majority city to take shape drains the city of a tremendous amount of taxpayer money. The vast majority of the white-collar workers in the city are white, and they head out to the counties and commute back and forth. Well, the Home Rule Act states quite specifically that the city government is not allowed to tax their incomes. They get taxed out here in the county. And so by the time the city has its own government in 1975, a majority of its white-collar workforce cannot be taxed by that government. Add to that the fact that the city has all these embassies, churches, and of course the federal government itself, and it can't tax half the land in the District of Columbia, right? And what's remarkable about the home rule government is it nonetheless figures out how to balance the budget and stand up a functioning city government after 100 years of congressional rule in the midst of this. But then the crack epidemic hits in 1985 and turns large swaths of the city into war zones. And the black middle class begins moving out in increasing numbers, primarily to Prince George's County. It is not, the black community of DC is not receiving a particularly warm welcome in Montgomery County, and so its major path out of the city is to the east, not to the north. That will change a couple decades later, but when we're talking about the 70s and 80s, black folks are not going north, they're going east. And once you get that decline in the black middle class population, the city really starts to struggle to balance its budget. It doesn't help that we become the murder capital of the United States of America in 1988, and then again in 1991. And if there's anything that symbolized the city's failure, so it's a sort of decline into dysfunction during this period, it was the drug arrest and the sting against Marion Barry in 1990 at the Vista Hotel, where he is filmed smoking crack cocaine. The city is able to come back. The federal government establishes a control board. It basically has to cop to the fact in 1997 that it set up a government for the district that was never going to be able to pay its bills. And so it gives it a huge cash infusion. It picks up things like it's paying for its prisons, paying for its roads and bridges. And the city has been in great economic shape ever since. We've posted either a balanced budget or a surplus every single year since, I think, 1999. So, you know, if the president says, you know, DC is really poorly run, at least not in that regard. But the city was able to do that primarily through gentrification. Remember, can't tax commuters, can't tax about half the land. What are you going to do? Mayor Anthony Williams puts together a plan back in 2002, is that we have to bring a huge number of high-income families back to the city. And when he announces it, people think he's nuts, right? DC's been losing population steadily since the 1950s. How in the world are you going to turn that around? But he figures it out. He's remarkably energetic and intelligent elected official. And he begins a process of bringing well over about 150,000 people back to the district from that point till today. Those people are high income, and they are, based on the racial wealth gap of the area, disproportionately white. The racial wealth gap in the area today is about 10 to 1. For every dollar that a black DC resident has, white DC residents have 10, right? And so with that imbalance of wealth, you can imagine who wins out in the struggle for housing in the District of Columbia. So the city gentrifies rapidly. In fact, it's one of the fastest gentrifying cities in the 2000s of any city in the country. And by the time we get to 2011, the city has lost its black majority from 73% in 1975 down to 49% in 2011. Today, it's somewhere in the area of 44% or 45%. But that was the way that our elected officials figured out how to balance our books. Now, I'm going to end with this because I don't want to be a total Debbie Downer with that story. That's the way it ended. And I should point out that, I'll just say this before I do the conclusion. One of the aspects of that story that really is quite laudable is that the counties that had for so long systematically shunned African Americans began to open up to them and have become some of the most diverse in the entire country. And that's primarily the counties of southern Maryland, to a lesser extent the counties of northern Virginia. They've become more multicultural largely through immigration, not as much through African American migration. But nonetheless, when you look at Montgomery County, Prince George's County, beyond that Charles, you actually see a much more multicultural picture after the first 30 years, almost 30 years of the 21st century than you did going back to the 1990s. And so kudos to Montgomery County. All right, let me finish with this. In closing, I want to return to the three themes with which I began and to President Trump. This is a frightening time for the district because DC has served as a stage, a laboratory, and a battleground. Many of us are fearful of how the current administration and the GOP majority in Congress will use us in their manufactured political dramas, how they will strip us of our rights as part of a larger assault on democratic cities, and how they will try out their favored policies here against our will. Every day I exhale deeply before I open the paper, bracing myself for the latest outrage. And our ugly present invites comparisons to our unjust past. Hasn't Congress always denied DC a vote in its ranks? Haven't they always played politics with our lives? Haven't racial reactionaries, sexists, and homophobes always made our nation's capital a monument to their mendacity? I would be lying to you and to myself if I did not admit that more often than not, they had. We spent a couple hundred pages cataloging as much in Chocolate City. But blessedly, that is only half the story. We spent just as much time chronicling the lives of abolitionists, union organizers, civil rights and home rule agitators, and anti-freeway stalwarts who forced their way onto the national stage and demanded a prominent place in the play, who used the city as a laboratory for abolition and an expansion of voting rights, and who created national models for police accountability and securing housing for the poor. In this moment, it is to that history that we must turn. We can mine it for ideas and for inspiration, and clear in the understanding that our forebears in this place have bent the arc of history towards justice, we can steel ourselves to continue the fight. Thank you.
If anyone had any questions for Dr. Musgrove. And if so, if you could please stand up and speak loudly since we don't have the microphone.
Yes.
Amy?
That was fantastic.
Thank you.
As I said earlier, really love the book so much, so thank you for coming. Really appreciate it. I would love to hear your thoughts about the Latino.
They can't hear you.
Okay, the Latino population.
Yeah.
You know, Mount Pleasant, like that whole area, and other places in DC. I was just reading online that the Latino population is actually increasing, Black population decreasing, white population decreasing. So I'd be curious to hear more about that and the dynamics there.
Yeah, thank you for that. So historically, I'll talk about historically and then I'll talk about more presently. The Latino population in DC is sort of has grown and developed in very tight association with our foreign policy. As we became an international capital after World War II, where you had all these embassies of in some cases, newly independent nations, you would get just embassy workers and their sort of support staff who would move to DC, and they kind of clustered as far as where they lived around Adams Morgan and a couple of stores that carried foodstuffs that allowed them to cook a lot of the meals from home. That population grew through successive migrations of Latin Americans over the course of the 20th century. And by the time that we get to the 1980s, you have a reasonably robust Latino population that really has no say in district government. And there's a pretty strong effort in the mid to late 1970s, primarily inspired by the Black Power movement, where Latinos in the district not only are able to say, look, we're here, this is how many of us there are, and this is what we contribute to this city. But as soon as that sort of happens, the city government gets taken over by, in this case, the Berry administration, who's elected in 1978, and the needs of Latinos kind of begin to recede within the city government's purview. At the same time that's happening, huge numbers of people come into the city, particularly from El Salvador, and the city is just not serving them, and they riot in Mount Pleasant in 1991, and we try to cover both of those developments. After the riot, what you see is the same problem that a lot of African Americans in DC face, which is that for poor people, and these are disproportionately poor populations, the city is just not that attractive, and so they head north, unlike African Americans who head primarily east. Latinos head north and east. And they really sort of reconstitute the center of the Latino population in the area around University Avenue. And so even though there's still a significant Latino population in DC, the center is really sort of straddles Montgomery and Prince George's counties. In recent years, I've been sort of shocked, quite frankly, to see that Latino immigrants have been capitalizing on the establishment of a huge number of cooperatives and low-income housing by a previous multicultural generation of activists in the 60s and 70s to establish those low-equity cooperatives and low-income housing, and they're sort of leveraging that to carve out a place for themselves in what's still a pretty gentrified city. And so parts of Shaw, which really didn't have as much of a presence of that type of housing, have really turned over. I mean, Shaw, which used to be 75% black, is 75% white. And the only reason that you have that 25% of African Americans in the area is because of cooperatives and low-income housing. Adams Morgan in Columbia Heights has a similar issue, but that low-income housing is actually growing because of a new group of Latino immigrants who are coming into the city, which really does buck that trend of heading out to the county. And so they're a big part of the city's history. And we certainly talk about Carlos Rosario, who's sort of the father of DC's Latino community as a unified group. But it gets really tricky because they sort of establish themselves as a group so late when it comes to a discussion of housing segregation. It's sort of off the books at that point, so they have a bit more freedom of movement.
Hi, thank you very much. This has been wonderful. I wanted to preface my question with a story about Marion Barry. Before the Corcoran Museum closed, we had a large exhibit on go-go music. Mm-hmm. And the exhibit included many, many things, including a photograph of Marion Barry in his prime. And the thing that struck me over and over and over again was that almost every African American who stopped in front of the photograph, and there were many, said, "He gave me my first love."
Yes.
And so my question is, would you consider doing a piece, it doesn't have to be a book, or an article,
Thank you.
about Marion Barry, the folk hero, because I believe that there is this, I mean, I had never thought of him as a folk hero before this, but yet the way that people spoke about him was so striking. So thank you if you do that.
Thank you. And I'm embarrassed. I didn't even properly acknowledge my in-laws who are here. Hans, Angie, Travis, of course, former county councilman Hans Reamer. Thank you guys for coming out and for being those kind faces in the crowd. We really try to do that in the last 3 chapters of the book. And so we have a bit towards the end, I think it's chapter 12, but don't quote me there. It's a long book. Where, we say, DC residents really turn on Adrian Fenty. And they've turned on Muriel Bowser a couple times. I mean, you know, she sent out a tweet about how she didn't like mumbo sauce. I don't like mumbo sauce, right? And you know, I mean, folks just took her head off, right? Like, you know, and she's, you know, she's like a 5-generation DC native. I mean, it's not like you can challenge Muriel Bowser's DC-ness, right? Although she doesn't say curry out. But you know, Barry, who is not from DC, he was born in Mississippi, he grew up in Memphis, didn't move to DC until he was in his 20s, is for most Black DC residents, a majority of whom, by the way, are not multi-generation you know, DC natives themselves. The majority of the Black population of DC moved to the city after World War II. But they see him as quintessentially DC. And part of that is it's political. It's talked about as sort of being about the city and its identity, but it's really politics. I mean, Marion Barry had a sort of populist politics rooted in sort of the liberal 1960s and 70s, where the idea was that we can use the government to better poor people's lives. He starts off creating jobs for poor men with Pride Incorporated in 1967. He takes the model of Pride Incorporated, which is around for almost 20 years, it shuts down in 1984, and brings it into the government with the Summer Youth Jobs Program. And remember, he's mayor 4 times, right? So he has a lot of time to give people jobs, you know, for his time as an activist, and then his time as mayor. And so my co-author, who is a DC native, got his first job through the DC Summer Youth Program, which is now called the Marion Barry DC Summer Youth Jobs Program. And so when you can say to people, I have worked my entire life to bring you things and to make your life better, they forgive a lot, like drug use. Womanizing, being at the Super Bowl while the city's covered in snow and saying people would be fine, right? I mean, like stuff that would ruin someone else's career. So you know, I think that's the reason, though. It's that he was also just flat out the best retail politician in the city's modern history. I mean, Tom Sherwood has this wonderful line where he says, you know, Marion Barry on the trail is like a 14-year-old perpetually on a first date. Right? I mean, just so solicitous of the other person's feelings, looking into their eyes. I mean, he's romancing the entire city for decades. And people really felt that. They believed in that. I mean, the only person I've ever seen do that is Bill Clinton. As much as I didn't like Bill Clinton, I couldn't help but be taken in during a couple of his speeches because he was just good at connecting with people. Marion Barry was like that, plus a little bit more. Yes?
Yes, and thank you, as all the others, I'm sure, appreciate what you're saying. Tell me this, I've never studied DC history, but what is the difference between federal city? I hear references, or I've read references to a subset of the District of
Yes.
Columbia, and so what is that, and what does that mean?
Yes, you know, and this is one of the horrible difficulties of doing DC history work because the city changes so daggone much over its period. So initially, when George Washington selects the 10-mile square that become the District of Columbia, there's 2 cities within its limits, Georgetown and Arlington. And those 2 cities, after Congress comes to town in 1800, maintain their own local governments. And the area where the federal district's downtown is going to be is called Washington City. And it is a separate town inside the county of Washington, effectively. So, you know, Shepherd Park, which is farmland during that time in the early 19th century, is in the county, in Washington County, right? And there's 3 municipalities within the 10-mile square. Washington City, which is where they're building the Capitol and the White House and stuff, Georgetown and Alexandria. all that stuff is combined into a single District of Columbia, a single governmental entity in the 1870s. And so for the first 70 years of the city's history, there's 3 cities and 2 county governments within the limits of the 10-mile square, right? And I'll just say one other thing. Even today, we have been making a distinction between the District of Columbia, the city, and the federal enclave. The reason for that is that the Constitution requires a federal district outside of the control of a state. And we came tantalizingly close a couple of years ago to passing HR 51 and S 51, which is the DC statehood bill. The DC statehood bill does not get rid of the federal district. It just shrinks it to the places where nobody lives. National Mall, the Capitol, the White House, a couple of government buildings, but like no apartments, none of the residential parts of the district. And the rest of what is currently the District of Columbia becomes Douglas Commonwealth. So we don't have to change the letters on our postage stamps. Right? So then you hear that distinction between the city and the federal district. The only place you really see the name federal city is in like discussions of federal city council, which is just a sort of good governance group that does studies and makes suggestions for how the district should move forward in the years ahead with like zoning and laws and things like that.
We just have 2 more questions, Tiffany, and then Landon, so we can close. It's not all just Michelle.
Thank you so much, Dr. Musgrove, for your book and for the talk. It truly has helped me during these difficult weeks, especially right now. But I want to ask, as a physician in this area, physician scientist in this area, how do you see the history of Chocolate City, what has evolved in Chocolate City? How has that affected health? How has that affected health disparities that we see today? What are measures that we need to be thinking about that are truly play a key role in what health looks like going forward as gentrification continues?
Oof, that's a huge question. And as you have already seen, I'm prone to take too long to answer. So I'll say this so that I don't finish talking in a half hour. The district's health disparities are not too different in their more modern iterations, so since the advent of home rule, than a lot of other cities that have gone from having a relatively robust welfare and regulatory state to a more austere kind of neoliberal politics. And so, before it went bankrupt in 1975, New York had public hospitals and free tuition at CUNY and all these other things. They went broke, and their financial control board said, get rid of all that stuff, let poor people fend for themselves, and we'll give a ton of tax breaks to rich people, and like that's how the city will come back, right? And roughly that same transition occurred in DC around our own bankruptcy in 1995. And so you had a very long period where, our public hospitals, DC General specifically, was sort of on the chopping block in order to get the budget balanced. The trick, though, about that story, whether in New York or DC, is that a lot of those public institutions have been neglected for decades by the city government, particularly the ones that were serving African Americans. Because before 75, in New York until 1989, you didn't have people in power who were going to make sure that those public institutions that served African Americans were roughly equally funded as those that served other groups in the city. And so when the city governments had to cut them, they were already in crisis. Like DC General was a mess when it was finally shut down. A lot of the hospitals in the Bronx and in Harlem were a mess when the city moved to shut them down. And so you have sort of 2 problems, right? I mean, one is all the detritus of the segregated era in the district. a lot of the public institutions that were geared towards African Americans before home rule were systematically underfunded, including DC schools. I mean, Congress had mandated that black and white teachers are going to get paid the same. But if you look at DC schools, ever since the Great Depression, one of the ways that the city government under Congress made sure that it was able to sort of balance its budget is to underfund DC schools at the rate of the money that they sent out per pupil. So they'd still pay teachers the same, but the actual money going to each school was lower. And that's as the black population is rising and the white population is declining. And so you'd have brand new, beautiful schools with all these beautiful new textbooks that were half empty in white parts of town. And schools where kids had literally, in the 1950s and 60s, never had a full day of school because the schools were so crowded that they were going to school on shifts in the black part of town, right? So, people going to school in trailers, high schoolers having to take classes in elementary school buildings. It's a mess. And Congress just never actively made sure that was evened out before the end of segregation in the city. And so sort of the same with healthcare. And so, yeah, I mean, you look at the numbers over time, you see pretty remarkable tuberculosis rates at the turn of the 20th century in the district among African Americans who are living in alley houses, and public health authorities are not really concerned about them. What you do have in the district, though, that's a big leg up is Howard University Hospital. And then belatedly, DC General before it gets underfunded at mid-century. And so it's better hospital facilities in the main, but never enough to make up for the underfunding that had preceded the early 20th century. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the very informative presentation. I learned a lot. I'm not from DC. I'm originally from Michigan. I really appreciate it. But I have countless questions. So my first question is, I really was fascinated by how foreign policy considerations eventually led to desegregation. You talked briefly about that. Are there any other instances in which you can recall where during the Cold War, or perhaps even after the Cold War, foreign policy considerations led to substantive policy changes within DC? Mm-hmm. And then also, you talked briefly about how DC was really challenged to boost revenue because they weren't able to impose tax on commuters or impose tax on the embassies. Have there been efforts within, pushed by the DC government to boost revenue by taxing embassies or foreign dignitaries?
So I can answer the second one first, and that is that's just illegal, so that's not going to fly. Just like there were, the idea of taxing commuters, that's just off the table. Tolls on the highways coming into the city, that's off the table. Just to give you guys an example, when DC first made an effort in the House of Representatives to push a statehood bill forward in 1993, it was the first vote on statehood. There have since been two, I think, in the 2020s. Almost all of the Maryland delegation from the surrounding counties voted against statehood, including Steny Hoyer, right? And the reason was that they were worried that if DC became a state, it would try to tax commuters. But what they were sort of admitting in that vote is that right now, the current situation that we're voting essentially to keep by voting against the statehood bill, they can't. It's just not on the table. It's banned by the Home Rule Act. And so that was never on the table, embassies and stuff like that. It'd be considered against the federal interest. And Democrats and Republicans in Congress would have pushed back against it. The first question, please, foreign policy. Oddly enough, if you read the articles on Trump's discussion in Air Force One about taking over DC, his rationale, not his actual reason, but his rationale is that I don't want foreign leaders who are coming to visit me seeing tent camps with homeless people in the public parks, seeing graffiti. I want to clean up, I want to take away democracy in the district so I can clean up the city so that it looks nice to the foreign leaders who are coming to visit me. Right? So it's a foreign policy rationale. It's absurd, but it's, yes, but that's not real, right? I mean, he's lashing out at a city that voted 90+% for everybody who's run against him in the last 3 presidential elections, right? I mean, we look like a Stalinist republic based on our vote totals against Trump, right? And he's sort of acting out a larger GOP attack on blue cities. If you know, we talk about what's happening in DC, but if you look at what's happening in St. Louis or to Austin or to Kansas City, you'll see that Republican-controlled state legislatures are trying to chip away at those cities' powers and to make them more subservient to the Republican parts of those states. Just as Republicans in Congress are trying to chip away at the very little amount of democracy we have here and make them subservient, and make us subservient to a Republican majority in Congress. But outside of the Cold War, there's not that much. There is a sort of foreign policy blowback, which is that DC and its metro area has been a tremendous catchment for immigrants from places where we have enacted very disruptive foreign policy, right? Central Americans during the dirty wars of the 1980s and 1990s. Ethiopians fleeing the Derg and then the fall of the Derg, right? Vietnamese folks who are primarily heading to Northern Virginia, oddly enough near the CIA. But after all the transformations in Southeast Asia. And so there is that blowback, but there's not as much of a sort of clear policy one-to-one that you see during the Cold War.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you all so much for coming.
Can we give him a hand? I owe all of you an apology, but I especially owe you an apology. We have meetings in here all the time, and the projector always works. And wouldn't you know, today it does not. So with that being said, there is a clipboard in the back. If you'd like a copy of the slides, put your name and your email, and I will make sure you all get a copy of the slides. If you want to review this again or have family members or friends, it has been live streamed, so it is on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. But we've got to give Andy Sullivan a big hand because he has stayed here all of this time to live stream this. And I didn't realize the time, so thank you all for staying. I feel like we can go on, and I really hope that we can bring you back again.
Thank you.
I really do. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank all.